consumers get from a change in the firm's distance? Bob?
Yes.
What's the marginal value that consumers get from a change in the firm's distance? If we change rho j by 1 unit, what's the marginal utility that consumers have from that?
Well, if so it takes t times xi minus
Yeah.
ti to travel to the store.
Yeah.
So a change in rho j. Well, let's see.
Depends on where you are,
It
right?
depends on where so it depends on xi.
Yeah.
So a change in rho j would mean that xi minus pj would decrease. So the
If?
amount they pay, if pj is getting closer to xi.
Exactly. So if you're to the right, then increasing rho j has a marginal utility of what?
It would have a marginal utility of t times
Of-
tpj.
Of t, right? Because it's just rho's just changing by 1 unit, right? So if you're to the right, then it has a marginal utility of t. If you're to the left, there's a marginal disutility of t, right? Okay. So,
Doesn't that assume costs are linear?
well, yeah, that was the assumption we made.
Okay.
Yeah. So I said
Oh,
that the cost of transport
Oh,
is
that's
this.
I'm sorry, I thought that was a function.
No, no.
Okay.
No. Okay. So if the firms start symmetrically about the center, like we have in this picture, then the marginal willingness to pay for rho j is going to be equal to t for the firm that's to the left, right? Because the marginal guy's in the middle, and negative t for the guys who's to the right. And because there's no cost of moving, you're always going to have an incentive to move towards the center, right? Yeah, Bob.
But doesn't that assume that your product is worth more than the time it takes to get there? Like if you're selling popsicles and
I see.
like for like in real regions,
Yeah,
they
so-
would be like
Yeah, that's right. So I was assuming that everyone's going to buy from one firm or the other. So there's no one who just doesn't buy the popsicle at all, right? And we're going to talk about the complications that come in with that in a minute. But here I was assuming that the product has such high value that everyone's going to buy from one guy or the other, right? So they have to be on top of each other at equilibrium. And if that point isn't 1/2, imagine it was 1/4, well then if you move just slightly to the right, you get everyone to the right, and and that's clearly better than what you would get if you stay there, right? Okay. So this leads to Hotelling's law, which is that in this simple model, the only equilibrium is that both firms are at the center. This is a very famous result. As Matt was pointing out, everyone would be better off if the two firms, or not everyone would be better off. Most people on average would be better off if there was one firm at 0.25, one firm at 0.75, right? Because then the people who are on the extremes would get better catered to, and the people in the middle would do a little bit worse, but not that much worse, right? It's a waste to have just two firms sitting at the center, right? So monopoly would actually do better in this case, because the monopoly would spread things out, right? So this is very widely applied, and it's very relevant for thinking about geography. But in other contexts, it's not even clear that the Spence direct distortion would go in this direction. Because imagine that this is a case where the marginal consumers are very unrepresentative of the average consumers, right? The marginal consumer is in the center, and that's to the left of one of the firms and to the right of the other firm, right? And there's nobody who's like marginal to just not buying the product at all, right? On the other hand, you can imagine a case in which the firms are at 0.25 and 0.75, and they're just stuck there. And then they're choosing like what color to make their product, or how high quality to make it, right? In that case, it might be that the marginal consumers versus inframarginal are mostly an issue of whether you're going to buy the product at all or not, right? And in that case, the ones that are just at the middle of the beach might be representative of all the people who are buying the product, right? And if that's the case, then competition between these guys is actually beneficial because it leads them to make their quality more similar to what an average consumer wants rather than what the marginal to buying the product at all or not consumers want, right? And so whether the monopoly or competition is better depends on whether the people who are switching between the two firms are more representative of the average consumers than the people who are just indifferent to buying the product at all or not are representative of the average consumers, right? So, yeah, Wesley.
If we're assuming some kind of disutility of travel,
Yep.
wouldn't two firms located close to each other necessarily drive down prices?
Well, it could.
Since then
It could.
the
So
firms being separated don't have to.
Yeah, we were holding fixed the prices, and that's fine here because everyone's going to buy one of the products or the other. So we can sort of ignore the issue of how many people buy or don't buy because prices, remember, only affect welfare to the extent that they affect the number of people who buy the product, right? So we were sort of abstracting from that issue. But yes, absolutely. That is a benefit of the firms being clustered together, could be to drive down prices. Okay. So, but Spence is going to offer, so I think this hoteling logic is a very good sort of baseline way to think about some things, but the Spence logic more broadly can help you think about things in a broader scenario. And one example of that, which is, I think, particularly relevant in the last few weeks, is what's called the median voter theorem. So this is probably the most famous application of the hoteling logic, and it's applied to political competition. So imagine there's two political parties that are competing, and they're choosing their position on a left-right political spectrum, right? And everyone is going to vote. Everyone's maybe forced to vote, but it's just a question of who they're going to vote for, right? So as a direct extension of hotelling's logic, what would we expect to happen in this competition? Yeah, Kay.
Well, the two firms are just going to occupy, like...
The two parties.
Or the
Yeah.
two parties are just
Yeah.
going to occupy the part where, like, the median voter is.
Exactly, the center of the political spectrum, right? That's right. So it says both political parties will adopt the position of the median voter who has an equal number of voters to her left and to her right. So this is probably the most fundamental result in all of political science, and it also matches with a lot of conventional wisdom, right? That in a two-party system, people always try to run to the center. A lot of people would use this to explain why Mitt Romney seems to have struck a very different tone in the month running up to the election than he did earlier, right? And a subsidiary result of this is that the more political competition there is, the less, say, incumbency advantage someone has, the more likely people are to run to the center, because if they have an incumbency advantage, they might be able to win even though they don't, compete that hard against the other guy, right? Okay. Now this is all very simplified, but there's a more general principle behind it. And we can see that by thinking about what's missing from the median voter model. So, where's Justin? Hey, Justin. What do you think are important factors that are missing from the median voter model? We made some assumptions earlier. What do you think of those assumptions might be problematic for thinking about real-world elections?
There might be people who are undecided between, like, there might be more than one issue that people
Yeah.
are, like, deciding between. So, like, someone might be conservative in one area or and liberal in another area.
Yeah, so we assumed that there was just one-dimensional left-right political spectrum, right? But that might not be true, right? Another issue is that, yeah, go ahead, Jacob.
Well,
Yeah.
another issue, we're still
Yeah.
making the assumption that everyone is going to vote for either one or the other.
Yeah, exactly.
So if you're too far in the middle and far from, say, the left, you might lose your far left.
Exactly. So we assume that everyone votes for one of these two guys, and not that there's a third party, or that people could choose just not to vote, to stay at home. Yeah, David.
Well, to address that part, why
Yeah.
would they, if they still have to vote, why would they not vote for the party? How could they possibly?
Well, but exactly. I mean, we assume they have to vote, but people could stay at home and not vote in the real world, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
No, that was what it was.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I see.
Yeah. Okay. So Spence's logic sort of shows us how to extend. So imagine that we first talk about the first issue. Imagine there's many different types of issues. What would Spence's logic tell us that firms try to appeal, that parties try to appeal to? It's not the median voter. It's more like what? Chairman Mao.
A swing voter?
Yeah. Who are this? What does it mean to be a swing voter?
People who aren't sure about who they're voting for, and so
Exactly.
they're like concerned about certain issues.
And you're going to choose your position to maximize what, according to Spence's logic?
How many additional voters you can get by changing your position slightly.
Yeah, the average marginal utility of those swing voters, right? Because that's what the Spence logic said exactly, right?
Yeah.
So you're going to choose your position based on the average marginal, which is sort of how do you get the most number of swing voters? Yeah, Wesley.
Do you see more of a drive to the center in compulsory voting systems?
That would be a prediction of this model.
Is there any empirical look at it?
I don't think so, but it's a natural prediction that comes out of this sort of logic. But I think I don't know if there's empirical work on that. It would be an interesting thesis if there's not. Yeah, Chengi.
Yeah, just to clarify, but
Yep.
there will also be problems with this model that there are more than two parties.
Yeah, we were absolutely. We happen to have basically a two-party system in the U.S., so I think at least for thinking about the U.S., that's not the most important objection. But yeah, and I think you can basically view people who vote for someone other than those two parties as basically voting for nobody, more or less. Yeah, David.
So Spence's assumption, based on that, looking at that marginal voter,
Yeah.
could also be the marginal voter who does vote and the marginal voter who doesn't vote.
Yeah, I'm about to talk about that. Yeah. So there are often different groups of swing voters. So in the U.S., there's people talk about what's called the sensible centrists versus radical middle. Sensible centrists are probably like a lot of people here, which is like pro-gay marriage, pro choice, but fiscally conservative, right? The radical middle, on the other hand, is a lot of sort of like working class white people who tend to be conservative on social issues but liberal on fiscal issues, right? And obviously, parties have to have sort of different policies to target these different groups. And if you look at actually how the Obama campaign run, one reason people think that they did so well is that they tried to decompose the set of swing voters into many different micro groups and target messages at each one of them, right? So they realized that there was heterogeneity even among the set of swing voters. Okay, so second is that parties, as David was just saying. Well, actually, why don't you explain, David, what you were
Well, I
saying?
was saying that maybe you're trying to, because turnout is such an issue, you're trying to get the marginal voter to not just vote for your party over another one, but in fact to just turn out.
Yeah, and in fact, there might be people who are, if they're going to vote, are definitely going to vote for you, but might just choose to stay at home, right? And you have to do things to get them to turn out, right? So you can use get out the vote efforts for that. That's obviously a huge part of elections. But there's also usually a debate within parties about whether they should run sort of a moderate candidate who will do a good job appealing to swing voters, or whether they should run sort of like an extreme candidate who will do a good job energizing the base and getting them all to turn out to vote. And in fact, I think a lot of people think that in 2004, George Bush won mostly because he energized his base rather than because he did an effective job running towards the center. Yeah,
so in
Jacob.
a political system like we have, where
Yep.
it's not how many votes you get, it's that you get more than your opponent. Wouldn't that also incentivize you to convince the marginal voters that would come in and vote for the other party to not vote?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you could think that that was what like some of the
Yeah.
Republicans were doing
But
with
that's what I'm saying.
like voter fraud stuff and so forth. Yeah, Andy.
So